Go back 2-3 years ago when we witnessed the jihadist blitzkrieg around northern Iraq and southern Syria. How do you account for the fact that the jihadists made such relatively easy inroads throughout many of these Sunni areas of Syria and Iraq?
Well, the circumstances in Syria were different from Iraq, but I'll talk Iraq. It's a bit of a truism in counterinsurgency theory that insurgencies collapse slowly and states collapse suddenly, right? So things look okay on the surface, things seem to be functioning, but you see increasing weakness and sort of hollowness in the security structure or in the political consensus, and then suddenly you get a quick collapse. And that's very much what happened in Iraq. Really, it was coming for a long period of time, probably from at least the middle of 2011, that the consensus that we've been able to hammer together between Sunni populations and the government in Baghdad had basically failed. And we saw a much more sectarian, Shia supremacist set of policies coming out of Baghdad that radically alienated people across the Sunni parts of Iraq. There's a town called Hawija, which is on the main road between Mosul and Syria, was the scene of a major massacre by Iraqi security forces against Sunni protesters in 2013, which was televised almost in full and generated what amounted to an Arab Spring within Iraq. And it was on the back of that the very large, capable, armed group from Syria broke back into Iraq and started mounting the blitzkrieg. One other thing that we've seen from ISIS that is relevant not only in Iraq and Syria but in Afghanistan is the use of terrorism to shape military and police forces to make it easier for them to mount a conventional attack. So in the fall of Mosul, they'd mounted maybe 6 months of increasing terrorist activity, consciously trying to lock the Iraqis down into a garrison mentality where they ended up guarding key points and vulnerable intersections and creating a laydown that was all checkpoints and guard posts, which alienated and pissed off the population, but it also fixed them in locations where they were guarding things. They didn't have a significant reserve and they weren't able to maneuver. And then on the 10th of June 2014, 800 ISIS guys with tanks turned up on the side of the city and took the city in a day because the Iraqis were not able to react because they'd been pinned in this defensive laydown. And I think we've seen similar things like that elsewhere. So yeah, it's fairly complicated, but yeah.
Some scholars would argue that the reason why many of these Sunni towns 2 to 3 years ago, like Mosul, Raqqa, Ramadi, Fallujah, the reason why they fell is because the folks living in these towns, predominantly Sunni Muslims, were more afraid of the sectarian regime in Baghdad than the Sunni jihadists themselves. In other words, here's the question: to what extent have sectarian regimes that are allied with Iran, thinking of Damascus and Baghdad, to what extent have they been more interested in seeking revenge against the Sunnis rather than building a nation?
Well, certainly that was a dynamic in Nouri al-Maliki's Dawa party and in the way that he approached governing Iraq after the Americans left. And the loss of American leverage meant that there was many fewer checks on that behaviour, which was always there after we left. I'm wary of sort of single overarching explanations. You know, I think it's a pretty complicated region, but I think it's certainly true that part of the driver of what we saw in Iraq and to some extent in Syria was regimes not governing with the interests of a large section of the population and alienating that population. What we've seen since then, though, with Haider al-Abadi and with the Defence Minister al-Abadi and others, is an attempt to really try to be more inclusive and to walk back from that. It hasn't fully worked, but it certainly is better than it was under Maliki.
Because a lot of the Sunnis who leave these towns after they've been liberated from Sunni jihadists, there is evidence from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that they do get discriminated against by not just the Iraqi army, but also the Shia militia.
Oh no, it's worse than that. I mean, there have been whole towns depopulated and the population expelled in a sort of Bosnian-style ethnic cleansing. around Tikrit. This happened in 2015. We saw it to some extent around Ramadi. That's one of the big worries about what's going on in Mosul right now, that there may be significant ethnic cleansing in the aftermath of the assault. I think that's a valid concern with respect to the popular mobilization units, the Shia militia. It's not such a concern with the Iraqi army, and in fact the way that the attack on Mosul has been structured has been very carefully put together to try to minimise the possibility for that, but it's still a very real risk, and more importantly it's in the minds of a lot of Sunnis that this might happen. I don't think that makes them support ISIS, it just makes them worry about what happens next.
Yeah. I was talking to Professor Joshua Landis from the University of Oklahoma. He's one of America's, probably the West's leading expert on Syria, certainly one of them. And he was just making the point that, irony of ironies, the Russian-led air campaign against the Islamic State or the Sunni rebellion in Syria, and particularly in East Aleppo, and the US-led air campaign in Mosul and Ramadi and Fallujah, in a weird way, they're doing the same thing. That is, they're propping up Iranian-backed, Shia-aligned sectarian regimes, and in the process, further marginalising the Sunni populations in these countries and perhaps inadvertently making the terror problem worse. How would you respond to Landis?
Yeah, I think if Bashar al-Assad were here, he would claim not to be sectarian, but to be secular. If you look at the sheer numbers, though, at this point in the campaign, the regime has killed about 9.5 times as many Syrians as the jihadists have.
Let's just get that right. So the Assad regime has killed nearly 10 times as many people as the jihadists have in Syria.
In Syria,
wow.
Yeah. So if you're an ordinary Syrian, the regime is much more of a serious threat to you than the jihadist groups. So I think there's certainly a lot of truth to that with respect to Syria. When the Russians intervened in Syria, it's important to recognise they weren't intervening against the Islamic State. They were intervening in favour of the regime. So they were basically targeting whichever groups were most threatening to the regime, and that was not Islamic State. It was mainly the secular and Kurdish groups. So those bore the brunt of the initial intervention, but over time they switched to more focus on Islamic State. But to your general point, though, I think Josh has got a good point, which is, if you think about the jihadists, right, they are fighting a war in both Iraq and in Syria against both incumbent regimes. The Russians are backing both incumbent regimes against both insurgencies. The Iranians are backing both incumbents against both insurgencies. We're the only player that's backing one incumbent against an insurgent and backing another insurgent against the incumbent, right? So we're on opposite sides of an imaginary line in the middle of the desert. We are playing two sides of the
Because we've been supporting the Sunni rebellion when I say we, the West, has been supporting the Sunni rebellion in Syria, but we've more or less been against the Sunnis in Iraq,
yes,
clearly putting it.
That's right. Now we've gotten ourselves into, and again, like, Donald Trump may not be your preferred change agent to fix that problem, but something's got to change because it's not working.
In August, September of last year, Putin decided to intervene in Syria. And at the time, President Obama said this would be a quagmire for Russia. Mm-hmm. Has the Russian intervention, to what extent has that changed the balance of power in Syria and the broader war against Islamic State jihadists?
Oh, it's totally transformed the war in Syria. If the Russians had not intervened, there would be no Bashar al-Assad regime today.
Is that a fact?
Yeah, they saved the regime. There's no doubt about that.
Which, in a way, would have been supporting the US policy of regime change in Damascus.
Yeah. I mean, the regime was on the point of collapsing a year ago.
And what would have happened if the Assad regime fell down late last year?
I think probably chaos. I don't think we would have seen the emergence of Jeffersonian democracy in Syria. But I think what you would have seen would have been significant gains being made by a coalition of jihadist nationalist groups. Ara al-Sham is one. Another was a group that at that time was known as Jabhat al-Nusra, now called Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. Sorry for the Arabic names, but it's the Al-Qaeda ally in Syria. And the head of that organisation has been extraordinarily careful to portray himself as first a nationalist and a Syrian, and focused on getting rid of Assad, and then we can all sit down smoke a hookah and talk about how we're going to make, what structure Syria is going to be. In fact, they are just as jihadist as ISIS. They just don't put it on television.
The best estimates suggest that there have been 400,000 deaths in the Syrian civil war over the last 5.5 years, 7 million refugees. These are the best estimates, at least. Thanks to the Russian intervention, is Assad now on the cusp of winning the civil war? And what does that mean? What does the end of the civil war in Syria really mean?
I don't think the war is going to go away anytime soon. I don't think that Assad is on the verge of winning it. And I don't think that's the Russian objective. The Russians aren't there. And again, this is why what we do tends to turn into quagmires, and what the Russians have done hasn't turned into a quagmire. Because we go in, we try to not only defeat an enemy, but also to stabilise, to govern, to stand up a democratic system, to restore the functioning economy. And that's a huge, multi-decade effort that takes vast amounts of troops. The Russians aren't interested in that. What they're interested in is propping up the regime and creating what I would call a frozen conflict in Syria, much like we've seen in Ukraine and elsewhere. Their geostrategic interests are a friendly government in Damascus and control over the Tartus naval base, which is their only Mediterranean naval base, and a certain amount of hinterland beyond that, but not necessarily the whole country. And in fact, the idea of Syria now is kind of meaningless, right? The Sykes-Picot Treaty boundaries that were established after the First World War, it's highly unlikely that they'll be re-established anytime soon. And so the Russians aren't there trying to do what we tried to do in Iraq or in Afghanistan. They're just trying to carve out a buffer zone around the areas that matter to them and hold that. And I think they can very well achieve that.
Before we go to the audience, let's talk about Donald Trump, because he's obviously the man in the moment. Not many of us predicted his victory yesterday, and many of us so-called experts are wiping egg off our faces, and I'm one of them. But it seems to me, David, that Trump and Sanders, Bernie Sanders, the socialist who gave Hillary Clinton a real run for her money in the Democratic primaries, when they questioned the US penchant for promoting democracy, subsidising US allies, the military interventions in the Middle East, they met a receptive audience all too often. Question, to what extent do you think the American people are war-weary and tired of the world?
Well, I think I would point out that, the US project of global primacy was really founded on things like the alliance system, the spread of global norms favourable to the United States, the Bretton Woods financial institutions, originally the UN, although that sort of changed over time, and the alliance system, ANZUS, NATO, and so on. All those things are elite level projects, right? You don't have working class whites in the middle of Pennsylvania in the 1950s getting all excited about the Marshall Plan, right? These were things that were done by elites. And I don't think that the average guy in the States hates or likes those projects particularly well. I think what you're seeing here is much more focus on the failure of the American economy and political system to deliver what people need, and it's a sort of middle finger to the establishment. And it so happens that this is part of the backlash.
Yeah, I mean, next month marks the 25th anniversary since the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you go back to the late 80s and early 90s, there was a consensus in the West that we were on the cusp of the end of history. Francis Fukuyama's endpoint of humankind's ideological evolution, the universalisation of Western liberal democracy. But the United States over the last 25 years has been at war for 22 out of those 25 years. There's arguably, especially hearing you tonight, there's no end in sight, even under a Trump presidency. And many people might say the results have been disastrous, especially in the Middle East. Has the notion of American global leadership been dealt a cruel blow as a result of these interventions in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a complex question. There's a guy called Steven Sestanovich who is at a think tank in the States who's written a book called Maximalist, where he starts a sort of history of American foreign policy with the Truman administration, and the point that he makes is that there's a cycle, right? There's like a sine wave where you get a maximalist, interventionist, often quite martial presidency, followed by a period of lesser intervention and a sort of pulling back. And he tries to characterise the different regimes or the different administrations since the 40s on that scale. I think the book's great. I think it's worth having a read, and I think he makes some very good points. But actually, I think that he starts the timeline too late. This pattern didn't start in 1947. If you go back to the middle of the 19th century and the Mexican War in the United States, and you run a timeline forward from there to now, you actually see a very consistent pattern where the US does a large-scale or long-duration intervention in about a decade, and then spends about 20 years backing off from that with a light footprint, trying to avoid getting into any more conflicts, and then I guess forgets how much the big ones suck, and gets back into it. And that pattern seems to be extraordinarily consistent and also totally unaffected by policymakers' preferences, right? I mean, Lyndon Johnson gets into 1964 with a policy that doesn't really include putting 600,000 troops into Vietnam, but it happens anyway, and I think that there's kind of a deep cycle that goes on in terms of interventions. We are clearly right now at the bottom of that sine wave, and I don't think there's any prospect that Donald Trump, any more than President Obama, is likely to put hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. Yeah. If you're worried about Syria, that's a huge issue, right? Let's imagine that peace breaks out tonight, and that the war in Syria, doesn't last until tomorrow. You still have, as you said, 7 million refugees, 400,000 dead, half the country is destroyed, most of the cities aren't functioning anymore. You're probably looking at a 20 to 30 year rebuilding effort just to get Syria back to being a functioning country, and probably 500,000 or 600,000 peacekeepers or some other kind of stabilization force to make that happen. Who's going to do that? It won't be the West. It certainly won't be the United States. So who would it be? There are people that have ideas on that. I have a couple myself. I think that it may well be Syrians currently in Europe that are part of that rebuilding. But the point is that the model of large-scale, long-duration Western intervention, even in the best possible circumstances, isn't going to fix the problem we're dealing with in Syria. So again, I think it's time for a rethink. I'm not necessarily a pro-Trump or pro-Hillary person, but I think that what we have been doing hasn't been working.
The general consensus about Trump is that he lacks a core governing philosophy, whether it be at home or abroad, and that he's erratic, strikingly ignorant of the world, that he shoots from the hip. It's a deadly combination. During the campaign, the very long campaign, he was saying, on the one hand, that America doesn't have a dog in this fight between the Shia militia and the Sunni jihadists, and that Western interventions all too often make a bad situation worse. But then he'll also say that he will wipe out ISIS. What do you make of Donald Trump, and what do you think he will do generally with respect to the Middle East?
This is going to sound a bit weird if you haven't been in Afghanistan, but he reminds me a lot of an Afghan tribal elder. We used to joke when I worked in Afghanistan that you can trust Afghans 100% to follow their own interest, right? Other than that, you can't trust them at all. And I think the hard thing with Afghan tribal elders is figuring out what is their interest in the moment, right? Yeah. And how are they going to act? And I think with respect to Donald Trump, he does have a central core governing philosophy. It's Donald Trump, right? And what's good for him is good for the country, right? And so I think it is possible to see the outlines of what that presidency would look like. It would be a bit more isolationist, it would be mercantilist, it would focus on the economic outcomes of alliance relationships. It would be much less inclined to engage in military intervention, certainly much less inclined to engage in foreign assistance. And I think we'd see some fairly predictable outcomes. What I don't think is directly predictable from the campaign, though, is what Donald Trump's foreign policy establishment looks like. So most of the Republican national security and diplomatic establishment rejected Donald Trump very early. Most of them went to Hillary. Some didn't. Some stayed out of both camps. That, to my mind, it represents how much of a continuity candidate Hillary was. She was literally the conservative candidate in terms of foreign policy. Now, in just the last 24 hours, all these people who were clutching their pearls and hyperventilating about Trump 24 hours ago are now crawling back to try to be part of the administration. Yeah. So I think what you're going to find, amusing as it may be, is that actually a lot of that talent that existed in the Republican Party will come back to him, and you may find that he's got some fairly decent people to draw on. The other thing is that the US governing system is based on checks and balances. I suspect those checks and balances are going to operate in a much more robust fashion as far as Donald Trump is concerned than they would have for Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. So I think you're going to find he's actually constrained a bit and is able to draw on some talent. Also, as of tomorrow, he starts to get the full unadulterated top secret intelligence briefings, and there's nothing like getting those briefings to change your.
He meets, yeah, that's right. He meets President Obama in the Oval Office overnight our time. We'll start taking some questions. So think about it. Just before we get the mics all ready, a question just on the US-Australia relationship, if you don't mind my asking. John Howard's on the ABC 7:30 report this evening, making the point that the US alliance is above and beyond any one individual, whether it's the President or the Prime Minister, supporting Malcolm Turnbull's remarks that normal programming will resume, that we should cut the new American President some slack. But not everyone agrees with Howard and Turnbull. Today in the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Harcher, Peter Jennings from ASPI have said that the Trump victory represents a crisis in US-Australia relations, and Jennings goes so far as to say we desperately need a plan B. How would you respond to that?
Well, actually, Greg was nice enough to mention that I was a visiting fellow at CIS about 10 years ago, and when I was here, I actually wrote a paper on this. You may want to look it up on the website, but I wrote about Australian strategic culture and how we have tended to pursue our grand strategy over the last century or so. And the point that I made in that paper is Australia's an island, it's a maritime trading nation, but it's never going to be one of the most populous or largest countries on the planet. By the way, we have a larger GDP than Russia does, but you know it's and so for about a century, Australian grand strategy has tended to be about recognizing that we can't be secure in an insecure global environment. It's been about identifying the power or the powers that best reflect our values, and then trying to align with that power to jointly secure the global environment to make Australia secure. So from 1901 until 1942, that global power was the British Empire. Mm-hmm. From 1942 onward, it has tended to be the United States. There was a period in the 80s and the early 90s where briefly we seemed to be wanting to make that the United Nations rather than the United States. But I think the general theme is fairly consistent, which is we look for the global power that best reflects our values and we try to partner up with them to secure the environment. The question is, does Donald Trump represent a departure from American values or just a reinterpretation of American interests globally? Frankly, I don't think we know the answer to that yet. So I would like to think that the alliance remains the bedrock of Australian grand strategy precisely because we still are the country that we've been for the last century, and because America still represents the closest thing to our values out there globally. But, you know, we've talked about this global wave of populism and the changing dynamics in Europe and elsewhere, so, you know, maybe that's not something that's set in stone. Australian leaders need to do what's best for Australia, and at the point at which our values diverge significantly from a partner, that partner's not a viable partner. So I don't think anything is, I don't want to be Lord Palmerston here, but you know, nations have no permanent friends or enemies, they have permanent interests, and we need to be focused on maintaining this. Yeah.
Questions? Yes, ma'am. Wait for the microphone, please, everybody. There it is. Thank you.
You talked about funding flows. I'm very interested in what are the funding flows for ISIS? Where does it come from? And how can you see those flows? And will they be perpetuated? Will they be increased? You know, it's a reflection of those interests. I'm interested in the funding issues.
So ISIS is extraordinarily different from Al-Qaeda in terms of where it gets its funding from. Al-Qaeda got a lot of funding from charities and from wealthy individuals, and at one time in its history from governments across the Middle East. And it also had its own business interests that it used to generate funding, primarily before 9/11. And then a lot of that went away after 9/11. Most of ISIS's funding has actually come from the territory that it controls and its taxation programs, where it taxes its population, and its businesses, where, for example, it sold water and electricity to the Syrian regime, it traded oil on the international market. ISIS has often been described as trading in stolen antiquities. That's actually not quite true. What they do is they tax freelancers who do that trade. So there aren't like ISIS operators who specialise in digging up ruins. What they do is they tax up to 80% individuals who they then let operate in their own territory. So it's more like a state, right, than like a terrorist organisation. In terms of funding in the West, which is what I was talking about, we see Criminal activities, bank robbing, drug smuggling, petty crime being used to fund groups that are involved in some of this activity. We also see individual small donations happening, and some of that is online. You can actually go on some of these sites, watch a video, and then click a button and go and donate. That's much less common than it used to be, primarily because we've got better at cracking down on that, but it still is a significant part of the funding. So very different from how Al-Qaeda was, and more state-like in the way that it approaches itself.
Yes, sir. Yeah, there is one.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for your speech, David. Of course, in hindsight, you would say we made a mistake going into Iraq and Libya and all these things in the first place. Would you agree with that in hindsight? But in your commentary, you didn't mention the Turkish situation and the complication where it straddles east and west. It allegedly is aligned with our coalition forces, but is against one of our major supporters in terms of the Kurds who are doing the ground forces. How does that all play out in this mix of things?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't actually have to go in hindsight. I actually opposed the invasion of Iraq at the time, but not that that really mattered, because I was a mid-ranking officer in the army, not a senior policymaker. The other thing is I was one of the army's experts in counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare. So when the counterinsurgency experts tell you if you invade Iraq, there's going to be a major insurgency, the response is, well, of course you think that, you're a counterinsurgency guy, right? But I'll tell you, I was in some of the planning for Iraq in 2002 and early 2003. There was a particular meeting where a very senior elected official came to the meeting and said, from Australia, and we were talking about the likelihood of the invasion. And I thought to myself, look, I'm never going to have a better opportunity than now. And so I put my hand up, and I knew this official, and said, look, sir, why are we doing this? You know, what's in it for Australia? Why are we doing it? What's the point? Why are we not doubling down on Afghanistan? Why are we going into Iraq? And he said, look, Dave, you're asking the wrong question. He said, the question is not, should Australia invade Iraq? The question is, the Americans are invading Iraq. Should Australia be in that or not? And he said, you know, when you ask the question that way, it answers itself. And I think he was right. I think we were going to have to be in that or walk away from this alliance structure that we've just talked about. But I do think that the UK, Australia, some of the other countries that were in the initial invasion, looking back now would say we probably should have used our leverage while we had it to try to influence the plan a bit more than we actually did. I think Libya was different. Libya was a case of goalposts shifting after the initial intervention. UNSCR 1973, the UN Security Council resolution authorising the intervention in Libya, specifically bans ground troops and says that it's only humanitarian and will not involve regime change. And that was a specific deal negotiated by Hillary Clinton and Vice President Biden with the Russians to prevent them from vetoing the Security Council resolution. As soon as we began the intervention, that all went out the window. We killed Gaddafi. She happened to be on TV when news of his death came, and she said in a very triumphal fashion, we came, we saw, he died. Russian military modernization and the move into Syria began that week, right? So the Russians were certainly very offended by our reneging on the deal. So I think that was a different kind of a problem. I'm sorry, I blanked. Turkey, yeah. I'm sure you've been to Turkey. The Turks have an extraordinarily difficult set of circumstances. They've got a majority Sunni population, which is partly being affected by the spillover of radicalism from ISIS. They also have been massively affected by the spillover of refugees and asylum seekers for years, and have been saying ever since 2011 that Assad's regime is the real problem, that we need to be focusing on ending the war in Syria first and dealing with ISIS as a secondary issue. If we'd have listened to them in 2011, we wouldn't be here now. There would not be an ISIS in Iraq if we'd have focused on preventing it from building up in Syria. Right, it's hard to remember now, but right before the Russian intervention, there was also a Turkish proposal which had some legs and may well have developed if the Russians hadn't intervened, which was to create a humanitarian safe zone in northern Syria to push down in a sort of box-shaped area about 100 miles into Syria, create a safe zone, not a no-fly zone, a humanitarian safe zone, partly in their case to relieve pressure on Turkey and allow some of the refugees to go back into Syria, but also to create, and this is the second issue for them, to create a buffer between their territory and the territory of what's now emerging as a de facto independent Kurdistan across Iraq and Syria. And that's a major geopolitical threat. So the Turks, I think, see the Russians, the Iranians, the Kurds, and ISIS as all parts of the threat spectrum, and ISIS is by far not the most dangerous as far as they're concerned. I'd argue that probably the Kurds are more dangerous to them. We in America and Australia like the Kurds, mainly because they haven't been shooting at us for the last 10 years. But actually, they are, the Kurdish national project, if we call it that, is as destabilising to the geopolitics of the Middle East as anything we've seen from ISIS. Very different in its content. We're not talking about jihadists here, but it's unravelling a system that's been in place, for 100 years. And I think Turks are extraordinarily, well, indeed, but the Turks are very worried about the impact of that on their own Kurdish population and on the secular nature of the state.
Yeah, someone there? Yeah. We'll get to you in a minute.
Thanks, David. Perhaps a more broader question. You've talked a lot about the foreign policy consensus in the United States between the Republican and the Democratic Party, and I think as someone who's sort of had their career in the military, in academia and in government, how do you think we can encourage a greater diversity in the foreign policy and defence establishment to avoid sort of mistakes, as you've discussed, in the strategy that we've been pursuing in the Middle East? I guess it's an interesting thing that despite the US having a much more developed system of think tanks and foreign policy experts, we've still got that broad consensus. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, if there's anything we should be doing to sort of encouraging a thousand flowers blooming, so to speak.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I was struck when Iraq began and the American foreign policy establishment rallied to put people on the ground for the coalition provisional authority, that many of the people who knew Iraq best were not asked to be part of that, and the people that ended up dominating it was the Europeanists, right? So the elite of the American foreign policy establishment through the Cold War were the people that specialised in the Central Front, so-called, right? Worrying about the Fulda Gap and Europe and NATO and so on. And when the time came, many of those who knew the region best had opposed the war in Iraq, along with virtually every counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare specialist. And so they didn't participate. They weren't asked, but they also probably wouldn't have volunteered to be part of the effort. And instead what you got was the guys like Bremer, who'd been Paul Bremer, the CPA head, who'd been the ambassador to Denmark, right? And that was his only ambassadorial experience, didn't speak any regional languages, hadn't spent any time there, went in there unsurprisingly with a frame of reference that didn't fit particularly well with the environment. This is going to be a slightly wonkish point, but my academic background is political anthropology. And, I did my PhD on Indonesian Islamic terrorism. I finished it 6 weeks before 9/11. I spoke several regional languages. I spent multiple years living and working in the region. I had a series of networks of individuals who I spoke to. And so I came out of what you might describe as a qualitative area studies background. Many people in the foreign policy establishment in the States anyway, don't come out of that background. They come from international relations theory, which is like economics without any reference to reality. And they come out of a very quantitative approach to political science. And I think reintroducing area studies and reintroducing the requirement that if you're going to pass judgment on the politics of a country, maybe you should have actually spent a day there and be able to speak the language, I think those kinds of basic requirements would do a lot to reintroduce a bit of diversity. That said, one of the things I learned very closely working for Condi is the incredible role of the president in foreign policy. The president has much less power in domestic politics than people think, and much more influence in foreign policy than many presidents realise, actually, when they first come in. President Bush's problem, I think, was that he delegated, and he probably doesn't care what I think about it, but he delegated too much to people like Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, the Vice President and Secretary of Defence, and didn't take control of a lot of what was going on directly in his own hands. The unsung hero of the surge in 2007 in Iraq was not Dave Petraeus, it was George Bush, who actually took control personally and had daily phone calls, weekly video conferences, knew the detail, was across everything, and was running it himself. And it was when he changed his approach that things changed. President Obama's been the opposite. He's tended to control things very tightly in his own hands and amongst a very small group of advisors, and not delegate at all to the departments. And we've seen both those approaches not work particularly well. So I do think one of the other things we need to be doing is structurally rethinking how the national security staff works and putting it back to something like what Eisenhower originally envisaged, which was bringing the entire staff of Supreme Allied Powers Europe and just putting it in the White House.
We've got time for probably one, maybe two quick questions. Yes.
Thank you, David. Paul Nettlebeck. You touched on this time as the low point in US engagement globally. Is there any other hopes, apart from Russia, particularly now that the UN has a new Secretary General, or are they a toothless tiger, which is just a waste of time and money in solving some of these problems?
You mean are there alternatives to the United States in terms of options for global leadership? Yes, absolutely there are alternatives. We may not like them though, right? I mean, those alternatives are the Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis, ISIS. There are alternatives. I think to some extent people have taken, including Americans, have taken US global leadership for granted, and would be, I think, unpleasantly surprised to see what the world looks like when it doesn't have that level of US engagement.
One last question, Ms. Mayor.
Thank you. David, you mentioned that the Iranians you feel are significant players, but you didn't really expand on that. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that the sectarian nature of the division in the Middle East between Sunnis and Shias, and particularly between Iran and Saudis, it seems to have a terrific potential.
It does, and I apologise for not getting into it in more detail. I think one of the worst things that happened at any time since 9/11 was the Axis of Evil speech, which was George Bush's State of the Union.
January 2002.
Where he came up with this idea, largely on the fly, within 24 hours before the speech, of linking Iran, Iraq, and North Korea into a so-called Axis of Evil. The Iranians, up to that point, had actually been cooperating with us in Afghanistan. Many of the Al-Qaeda leaders from Afghanistan who had fled into Iran after the invasion had been locked up by the Iranians. And there was an ongoing series of talks, which were secret at the time, but have since been talked about, that were really aimed at trying to carve out a collaborative approach. When that speech happened, the Iranians basically said, well, that's it. And when we invaded Iraq a few months later, or a year and a bit later, we put them into an extraordinarily dangerous situation where they had US-led intervention forces on their eastern and western borders, and they had us describing them as the Axis of Evil, and talking, to some extent, you saw people like Charles Krauthammer talking about this after the invasion of Iraq, saying, you guys are next. And the Iranian intervention in both Afghanistan, which doesn't get talked about very much, and in Iraq, happened largely from a defensive mindset to try to create enough of a bandwidth challenge to us to make it hard for us to then carry out that threat of regime change in Iran. And that's been a driving factor for them, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and in their drive to get nuclear weapons, because that's the ultimate, as the North Koreans demonstrate, that's your ultimate guarantee about not getting subjected to regime change. So I think the Iranian approach initially was very defensive. What's happened since the Iranian nuclear deal is that there's a flood of money coming back into the Iranian economy. The Iranians have come out from under a lot of the sanctions issues. It's much easier for them to move around regionally, and we're now seeing very large-scale Iranian intervention in both Iraq and Syria. And I'm not talking about one or two advisors, right? We're talking about hundreds of plane loads of troops and money and weapon systems and organised units. Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, which is the sort of somewhere between the Special Forces and the CIA and the Iranian structure, is very publicly running around the outskirts of Mosul right now, rallying the troops. These guys have become really significant regional players. I think we've got to figure out how to deal with that as we find it, and not try to go back to something that existed before the nuclear deal. But I think, as you said, the threat of Iran is much more serious than the threat of ISIS in the eyes of many regional players: Turkey, Jordan, Israel, the Saudis. And so you've got to deal with that. Otherwise, you're going to be asking people to fight our enemy rather than the people that they see as a significant threat.
But then, to be the devil's advocate, many of the Sunni Gulf allies of the Americans, the Saudi Arabia, Turkey, have been accused by Joe Biden, among others, of aiding and abetting many of the Sunni jihadists.
Yeah. I think there's certainly some data, and I won't get into it here, that suggests that some of that at least is true. You didn't mention the country that specifically people worry about, but I think there's certainly some truth to the idea that governments are conniving at the existence of this group primarily because they're worried about the Iranians. The other thing that you see, and you see this particularly in North Africa, is people saying, oh, you want to be a foreign fighter, you want to travel to Syria? Be my guest, right? Leave our country, here's a plane ticket, and that sort of makes sense in the short term, but ultimately it comes back to bite you, as I think people have found in Morocco and elsewhere.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps things up, the formal proceedings for this evening. On behalf of the Centre for Independent Studies, let me thank the Hilton Hotel for hosting the event this evening, and of course, most importantly, Virgin Airlines for their ongoing support for the Lighthouse lectures. On behalf of the Centre for Independent Studies, thank you very much, David Kilcullen, and thank you all.